Hello and welcome. I'm Bulletproof Leonard, and you're watching Ferocious Feasts, the show where we put two randomly selected animals in an arena and watch them fight, then eat the one that dies. No, that's not true. That's not my name, and that's not why we're here. Instead, we're here to do something a lot less gruesome and violent, and that's talk about Crash Bandicoot, one of my top 10,000 favourite things to do. I think it's safe to say that after Mind Over Mutant, the Crash series was pretty much dead. For a long time, the world heard nothing more from him. He had passed away. It was a tragic time. I held an extravagant personal funeral for the Bandicoot to mourn his passing, which included esteemed guests such as me. It was a solemn and dignified affair. The caterers did a fantastic job. They brought out a platter of canapes. Turns out, I didn't know what a canapé was. I thought it was the top part of a tree. You can imagine my confusion when it was announced they were doing canapes, and they weren't wandering around with a giant platter of branches. I was fully expecting us all to be munching on leaves like a bunch of grief-stricken koalas. No, I was thinking of canapé. A canapé is a small pile of food that you sometimes eat off of a stick. So in a way, I wasn't that far off. But the canapés are not important. What's important is that Crash Bandicoot was dead. When you look back on the series, it's clear that it's been turbulent. It started off strong with Naughty Dog's trilogy and bonus kart racer extravaganza. These games were instant classics in huge parts of my childhood, and they're some of the games I'm proud to have on my shelf. But from then on, well, it was anarchy. Crash was passed around from developer to developer in what I can only describe as a Bandicoot bukkake, with each developer having their way with him and leaving their mark on the marsupial's history. Some stuck with familiarity, some got experimental, and some completely shat the bed. These games have a little bit of everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and they are also some of the games I have on my shelf. It's been a wild ride, but in the end, it was too much for poor old Crash. Weak, tired, and sticky, he faded into obscurity, never to be seen again. But then, on one fateful day, a necromancer at Activision had the brilliant idea to bring Crash back to life. They decided to take him back to the days before he was drowning in the jizz of multiple game development teams, and allow us to relive his glory days remade from the ground up. This is the Crash Bandicoot N Sane Trilogy, a full remake of Crash's 1, 2, and, would you believe it, 3. The task of recapturing the magic of these games and modernizing it for a modern audience is not an easy one, and being an improvement on the originals, even more so. The question on everyone's minds is, did they succeed? Is the Crash Bandicoot N Sane Trilogy better than the originals? Let's find out, starting with Crash 1. I think it's fair to say that of the original games, the first one has aged the worst. Times have changed, but Crash 1 hasn't. Its own primitive gameplay aside, it made a few choices, and while they may have made sense at the time, it took the developers less than a year to realize those choices were dumb as fuck and rework things for the sequel. Things like death cancelling out your chance to get gems, and only being allowed to save after completing a bonus round for which you have one attempt, or by collecting a gem which you can't do if you die. These things and more hold Crash 1 back, and are the reason why the game is weaker than its younger siblings. The N Sane Trilogy has the opportunity to right the wrongs of the past, and give Crash 1 a much needed modernization to help put it on even footing with 2 and 3. Let's see how it did. So the N Sane Trilogy's goal is to recreate the original games as accurately as possible, a key part of which is replicating the gameplay. In Crash 1's case, I feel like this was pretty hard to fuck up. In the original, Crash could only run, jump, and spin, which is more than what most creatures can achieve in their first year of life. All I could do was cry and shit myself. But still, very simplistic gameplay, and the N Sane Trilogy replicates it really well. It does feel a bit different. Crash does seem a bit faster and heavier than he was in the original, but I'm not sure if that's just my brain playing tricks on me. I had a similar problem when I played the Spyro Reignited trilogy, where I couldn't actually tell if the movement felt different or not. Like, does it actually play differently, or are the animations just making it look like it plays differently? I can't say for certain, but what I can say is that if it's not perfect, it's pretty bloody close. I didn't have any problems with how Crash controlled, and the levels are essentially exact recreations as well. I mean, I don't really have anything else to say about it. I reckon they nailed recreating the gameplay. It felt like Crash 1. Crash himself, the levels, the bosses, the world map, all of it was pretty bang on. The only actual gameplay difference is that Papu Papu has 5 hit points instead of 3. Probably the developer's way of making sure you can hear his boss music loop at least once, which was impossible in the original, and even then, it only just scrapes by with one loop. And wouldn't you know it, they also went ahead and recreated the music and visuals. As you can see with your eyes and hear with your ears, they didn't go for a one-to-one sort of recreation. If they went with the polygonal art direction and classic PS1 soundscape for this, then they may as well have just re-released the originals on modern consoles. Instead, they went with a more modern presentation, and when you step back and really take it all in, no shit. Visually, they went with the sort of semi-realistic vibe. Obviously, you've got the wacky and zany characters and locations, but the actual environments themselves are sort of halfway to realism. I particularly noticed this with the water. I think it looks pretty good. It doesn't really strike that same nostalgic nerve, and the vibe is definitely different, but I like the way it looks. Musically, they did a really good job as well. It definitely sounds like Crash 1 with all the same melodies and riffs, just cleaned up a bit more thanks to the power of modern technology. I do think some tracks have lost a bit of oomph, but that doesn't make them bad by any means. But this remake of Crash 1 is not faithful in every way. The developers saw fit to make some changes and not to inherit some of the blatant flaws from the original. Firstly, the gems. No longer does dying punish you so heavily. If you do die, you are still able to collect a level's gem so long as you've broken all the crates. Unless that gem is a colored gem, in which case, like committing treason in the United States, the death penalty still applies. This is a great change as it takes out a lot of unnecessary frustration and anguish for players who are really bad at the game. It makes things more comfortable overall, so I can't really complain about that. You can now attempt bonus rounds as many times as you like. No longer are you limited to a single attempt. If at first you don't succeed, try again. This is a great quality of life change, although bonus rounds aren't used for saving anymore, instead they count towards the crate total, so really it would be more accurate to say that the function of bonus rounds have changed, like how phones used to be used as a way of speaking to people over a long distance, but now they're used to get kids to shut the fuck up while at the shops. Bonus rounds are no longer used for saving, instead you can now save whenever you wish while in the world map, which is fantastic. Literally every quality of life change I would have asked for has been implemented in this Crash 1 remake, and I'm over the moon. But the changes don't stop there, because there are some brand new additions to this game that will carbonate your stomach juices like nothing else on planet Earth. That might be hyping it up a bit too much, but I stand by it. These are some wicked additions. First and foremost, you can choose to play as Coco, which is genius, and she plays just like Crash, not a shittier version of Crash like she was in Wrath of Cortex. Aside from riding hogs and fighting bosses, which she's not allowed to do for some reason, Coco can do everything Crash can do, and that's awesome. It's not adding anything to the gameplay, but it's great to have the option. Shout out to the women. This remake also adds in time trials. Originally introduced in the third game, time trials test your skills and challenge you to complete a level as quickly as you can without dying. It was a fun new feature in Warped, and in the Sane Trilogy they've been brought back for Crash 1. Also genius. It adds a whole new layer of content for Crash 1, which originally was pretty bare bones as far as that's concerned. I think they made the time trials work really well here. It showed off these old classic levels in a different way. Some were fast and satisfying, others maybe not so much, but it was an enjoyable way of revisiting these levels. But I think my favourite addition to Crash 1's remake has got to be Stormy Ascent. For the unaware, Stormy Ascent is a fabled level shrouded in mystery. This level was intended to be in the original Crash 1, but for reasons that include the level's difficulty and time constraints on development, it ultimately had to be cut and did not end up in the game. Officially, that is. The level does actually still exist in the original. Buried deep inside that PlayStation disc is the data for Stormy Ascent, and it's even on the back of the box in one of the gameplay screenshots. For a long time, the elusive Stormy Ascent was a level that was all but forgotten. It is possible to actually play the level in its original incomplete form, with broken bonus tokens and enemies that aren't programmed correctly. I've done it myself, it's a brutal level, but it was incredible, and the Sane Trilogy came along and decided that everyone deserved to feel the pain. Adding Stormy Ascent as an official level in this game was a masterstroke. It's a very challenging level, it's very well designed, and it has a really satisfying flow to it. It's hard. Really fucking hard. And don't even get me started on the time trial, I have no idea how I ended up with a platinum relic. But I gotta say, I loved every minute of it. Between the accurate recreation of the gameplay, the updated presentation, the much appreciated quality of life changes regarding gems, saving and bonus rounds, and the extra content in the form of Coco, Time Trials and Stormy Ascent, I think it's fair to say that this is a brilliant remake, and dare I say, the definitive way to experience the first Crash Bandicoot game. It's the same game, without all the bad stuff, and with some added good stuff. You can't really argue with that. But I wonder if it will be the same situation going forward. Onwards and upwards, it's time for Crash Bandicoot 2 to strike back with the remake of Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back. Now with this game, I'm not fucking around. Crash 2, the original, was the first game I ever played. Or at least the first game I remember playing. Other games I remember playing include Chasey, Hide and Seek, and in history class we also used to play a game called Who'd Be Hitler's Favourite. I would always win because I most closely resembled his ideal German boy. Jawohl, mein Führer! Not that I'm proud of that, I didn't want to be a Nazi. And still don't. The point is, Crash 2 is my baby, and I will not tolerate anything this remake does to tarnish its reputation. Pressure's on, bitch! Crash 2 took the first game's primitive gameplay and built on it in a variety of ways, most of which being parts of Crash himself. Crash 2 added in the slide jump and belly slam moves, which gave Crash a lot more options when it came to getting around. Like with the first game's remake, this remake has pretty accurately recreated Crash's movement here. They even included that crouch spin jump technique that existed in the original, which I'm pretty sure was an unintentional feature back then. So the fact that they brought that back as well is pretty cool, great attention to detail. And the vehicles as well, the jetboard, jetpack and polar, are all pretty bang on. Not exactly bang on, they do feel a teensy bit different, but that could be another case of the game's animations playing mind games with me. One of the non-Crash related additions in Crash 2 was the introduction of nitro crates, devilish and hyperactive crates that explode when you make contact with it and instantly kill you. Reminds me of a cat I used to know called nuclear love pipes. They serve the same function in this remake, but part of me thinks they gave the nitro crates a bit too much juice. I know they're meant to be hyperactive, but I feel like it's a bit too much in the remake. They just get too excited. For example, in the bonus round of Sooner or Later, this happened. When activating the switch crate to make the regular crates appear, the nitro crate just so happened to jump and get stuck inside the regular crate, forcing the regular crate to push it out, leaving that whole configuration of crates completely fucked. And this didn't just happen once, it happened twice. If the nitro crate had just sat still a bit more, this whole debacle could have been avoided. But the one nitro crate that stood out to me most was a nitro crate in Piston Away's death route. This was some bullshit. As I was making my way through the hazards, I approached and attempted to jump over a nitro crate. And, well, let's just watch what happened. Can we get an instant replay on that? What in the fresh hell was that? I did everything right in that scenario. The nitro crate was placed on the ground. The game wants me to jump over it. I jump over it, and the nitro crate leaps up to catch me and kill me. What was I supposed to do about that? What do you do when you're mid-air with a nitro crate up your rectum? That's not fair. Red card. Foul. 3 strikes. Get out of here with that shit. I mean, it did perform the function of a nitro crate, it exploded on contact, but in all my years of bandicooting, I've never seen the contact initiated by the nitro crate. It was a first for me, and it sucked. But aside from the few rogue nitro crates who think it's cool to break the rules, the nitro crates functioned the same as they did in the original. I just wish the N-Sane style of presentation did a bit more for this game. In the first game's remake, N-Sane's art style worked decently well. Here, I'm not really feeling it as much. I think it looks good, but I don't know. I feel like the visuals don't pop as much, and the soundtrack doesn't have as much soul. Maybe it's just because I have a pathetically deep connection to the original version of Crash 2, and so I'm instinctively holding it to a higher standard. And, don't misunderstand, I do like the remake version's presentation, but it just isn't hitting the same as it used to. That said, this remake does make up for that in other ways. The original Crash 2 wasn't lacking in the quality of life department, I think it did pretty well. But the remake did make one change that never even occurred to me as the thing that the game would benefit from. Avid Crash 2 players will know about the secret warp room, a warp room only accessible by finding hidden exits in other levels. The only way to access the secret warp room in the original is to use one of those hidden exits. There's no other way in, so if you want to revisit it, you'll have to go through those exits again. The remake changed this so that once you've discovered the secret warp room, you can access it at any time from the regular warp room. And that makes so much sense. If you uncover a secret, you have the information. You don't need to re-uncover the secret every time you want the information, because you've already uncovered the secret. And that makes sense for the secret warp room. Also, I like that you can see some fireworks in there when you complete the game. That's pretty neat. And like the first game's remake, Crash 2's remake also boasts some new additions. Coco is playable here as well, and that's really cool. It kind of doesn't make any sense at all because of the story. Throughout the game she's all like, "Crash, are you there? I can't communicate with you for long, Crash, be careful." And it's all very frantic with a whiff of desperation. Meanwhile she's just standing there in the second warp room the whole time. She could have just spoken to Crash directly. But I guess that would have ruined the story, huh? Time trials are also added to this game, but I think they're done better here than in the first game's remake because Crash 2's remake also brings in the speed shoes. After defeating Cortex, you get given the speed shoes, one of Crash 3's power-ups that allows you to run really fast. This is great for the time trials, which I think in this game are pretty fun and handled very well. It's weird considering none of these levels were originally designed with this much speed in mind, and yet it works. Unfortunately though, there is no bonus level in this remake. The remakes of Crash 1 and Crash 3 both got new levels, but for some reason Crash 2 missed out. I kind of feel bad for it. It didn't do anything wrong. Why was it denied a bonus level of its own? There are some cool themes in this game to work with. They could have done a cool new Ruins level or something. Or maybe contacted the original developers to see if there were any levels that were cut from the game initially. I don't know, it just was like a bit of a shame. But I reckon apart from that and the Nitro Crate travesty from earlier, they nailed this remake. I think it does also lack the original's charm, but with the addition of Coco and the time trials and general quality of life improvements, it's hard to knock this game. Even if I would personally go back and play the original over this because I'm a nostalgia bitch for it, I do believe this is the definitive way to experience Crash 2 in the modern era. My butthole is puckering at the thought of playing this. Crash 3 is a great game, but of the games in the original trilogy, it has the most crap, so naturally there is a lot that could go wrong here. But we'll see how it all plays out. Much like 1 and 2, Crash 3's remake remains pretty faithful to the source material when it comes to Crash's movement. All of his moves from Crash 2 are carried over, and he now has access to his 5 power-ups: the Super Body Slam, Double Jump, Death Tornado Spin, Fruit Bazooka, and Speed Shoes. And, following the pattern that's been established across the Sane Trilogy, they all work pretty much identically to how they used to in the original. I have gone on record to say that I don't like the power-ups because they can trivialize a lot of the game, and I still think that's the case here in the remake, but that's not the Sane Trilogy's fault. That's the original's fault. We can't blame the current generation for things that happened in the past. No one can buy a house at the moment, not because the current generation is lazy, but because the older generation fucked it all up in the first place. And that's what's happening with Crash 3's remake. The vehicles is what I was worried about most, because even some of the better ones weren't that great. So I did shut a little bit at the thought of having to go through them, but honestly, I actually think they did a pretty good job. They made the most of what they had to work with. I reckon for the most part, the vehicles have actually improved somewhat. Pura and the planes are about on par, just as good as they were in the original, but the other vehicles, I was actually surprised at how they turned out. In the underwater levels, I felt like I had more control over Crash, and that he wasn't as all over the place. He was in good form. The jet ski did feel different, but not so different that the movement was impacted in any meaningful way. What I did notice was that the jet ski's hitbox when flying off the end of ramps was more generous. I found it was much more consistent with breaking crates. And the motorbike? It was my least favourite in the original, but in the remake, I actually don't mind it. It didn't feel as stiff. I felt like I could actually turn the bloody thing. In fact, I didn't mind it so much to the point where I successfully attempted to collect Area 51's clear gems and platinum relic all in one go. Probably the biggest boner I've ever had playing a game. I think this is the only instance in the whole Sane Trilogy where the actual gameplay itself has improved. It might just be my personal preference, but a lot of these vehicles feel much better to use. And while I wouldn't necessarily call it an outright improvement, I do think the Sane Trilogy's presentation works best for Crash 3. Something about the locations and music really lends itself to this style. I feel like it's the most vibrant and colourful, and I also think they nailed recreating the music. It feels very atmospheric while also remaining bouncy and catchy, which is a hard thing to balance, I think. It also benefits from having the most cutscenes, so you really get to take in the voice acting and animations, which I think were done really well. It's just kind of hard to fault. Crash 1 and 2 had a lot of additions in their remakes that added some extra flavour and content, and most of that was down to Coco being playable in almost every level, and also time trials. Crash 3 unfortunately can't really benefit in the same way. Time trials were in the original Crash 3, in fact it's where the time trials started, and Coco was already playable in a number of levels too. Sure, she can now take part in more levels than before, and also using the time twister to explain how she goes back to become playable in the first 2 games is genius, but I don't think it's enough to qualify as an addition in this case. Everything that was added in the first 2 remakes, whether that's gameplay features or extra content in the form of time trials or general quality of life changes, were already present in the original Crash 3, so unfortunately the remake version has gained the least. But it has gained something, and it's one hell of a something. Similar to how Crash 1 gained Stormy Ascent as a bonus level, Crash 3 has also gained a bonus level, but what makes it special is the fact that it's an entirely original level, Future Tense. At the time of its release, Future Tense was the first original Crash level since Mind Over Mutant from a decade prior. And holy shit, what a level! Future Tense is incredible. It's such a well-designed level. It makes good use of all the power-ups without you being able to exploit them too much. It has lots of alternate paths and secret areas. It has a death route. It has so many creative ideas like using reflections from windows. Even the bonus round is genius. It's such a brilliant level. It's tough and challenging, but it's fair. And it has a really fun time trial as well. It's absolutely amazing. Even though Crash 3 gained the least in its remake, I would say that Future Tense alone makes the remake of Crash 3 the definitive way to play Crash 3. Easily. So let's just look back at this all, shall we? Crash 1's remake was great. Crash 1 had the most to gain from a remake, and it gained. Mainly related to quality of life changes, sure, but the extra content in the form of playable Coco, time trials and Stormy Ascent are hard to ignore as well. Crash 2 also gained a lot in a similar way, barring the bonus level, and while the presentation I felt was weakest in Crash 2's remake, it still looked and sounded amazing. Crash 3 gained the least from its remake, but what it did gain was absolutely phenomenal. Future Tense was a breathtaking bonus level, and I think the remake's art style complemented Crash 3's levels and soundtrack the best. I did say with each game that the remake was the definitive way to experience them, so I think it makes it pretty bloody obvious that the Sane Trilogy is better than the originals. Honestly, it kinda stings to have to admit that, because the originals have a very special place deep in my liver. I don't want to say that they're inferior to the remakes, but even my own personal bias and nostalgia isn't enough to overpower the truth. The Sane Trilogy is the definitive way to experience the Crash trilogy. I can't fault them. They recreated the gameplay extremely well, while improving the whole journey with modern touches that just make it much more comfortable to play through. And on top of that, as a physical game, it's much easier to get your hands on and play. Do you know how much harder it is to find a genuine PS1 and genuine copies of these games and have them all work? It's hard, and it's expensive. The Sane Trilogy is much easier to scoop up, and it's the best way to play Crashes 1, 2, and 3. I honestly think that anyone who disagrees with that notion is simply blinded by nostalgia. At this point, it's just factual. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm off to go watch Ferocious Feasts. I hear they've got a binturong in the ring this week. I hope it wins, those things are so cute!